Hello everybody, I hope you are keeping well during this lockdown, and I hope you're getting on well with homeschool and OneNote. What we're going to look at this morning is we're going to look at the role that women had in the Middle Ages. So we've spent quite a lot of time, from the Battle of Hastings all the way through to the Peasants' Revolt, looking at major events of the Middle Ages, and quite often this has involved looking at the men in power and what the men in power did and how men reacted to this, because as we'll see, men had a very dominant role in society in the Middle Ages. But what we're going to do now is we're going to take a little bit of time to actually explore in more depth the lives of women and the role that women had at this time in history. So what I want you to do just now, I want you to picture in your head what you think the role of women was in the Middle Ages, in medieval England. What most women did, what they were thought of. So just take a minute just to think about this. So I'm going to now show you part of an image from the Middle Ages, and here you can see there's a man, and he appears to be maybe begging or pleading. So have a little think about what might be in the second half of this image. So the top of this image is missing. So what might he be? Who might he be begging to or cowering from? Now I'm sure that you've had lots of thoughts about what might be making this man quiver and shake and beg for mercy in such a way. Well, let's find out. So here we have probably his wife is holding what is known as a distaff. So a distaff was used to wrap the thread around when women used a spinning wheel to weave wool into thread, which they could then use to make garments. And here she is brandishing it as a weapon, about to teach her husband a thing or two. And what I love about this image is it turns on its head what we assume a woman's role was like in the Middle Ages. That they were very subservient to men, that they would do what they're told, they get married and look after children and be quiet. But actually this image bursts that to pieces, doesn't it? It actually shows that women in the Middle Ages were as strong and as independent as they have always been. So this image is just one image we're going to look at, which illustrates the role of women in the Middle Ages. And a lot of these images, they come from manuscripts like this one. So these are documents which usually a monk has taken time to write in a monastery, because there were no printing presses or printers or anything. So all documents were handwritten. And the monks will quite often illustrate these manuscripts by either, you see there one of the capital letters is beautifully illuminated, and sometimes they'd include little images of the world around them in those illuminated letters, or sometimes just at the bottom or in the margins they would decorate the image with images of the world they see around them. So here we have an example from a prayer book which is called a psalter, because some prayers are called psalms, and so psalms are written as psalter. And this was a psalter which was created for a man called Geoffrey Luttrell. So this was known as the Luttrell Psalter. And you can see just down the bottom there's the picture of Geoffrey Luttrell having a meal with his family. So this is just one example of the images that are in these manuscripts, because people quite often didn't have the time or the money or actually the equipment to produce big paintings or individual illustrations. So a lot of the images we have of everyday life in the Middle Ages are from manuscripts and the doodles and the illustrations of the monks in the margins. And there's some wonderful pictures to look at. But we're going to be focusing on pictures that illustrate the role of women. Now there are three things which really define the role of women in the Middle Ages. The first of these was the kind of cultural acceptance that women were weaker than men. And as we talked about, everybody was religious, everybody believed in God, and everybody believed the word of the Bible. And one of the core stories in the Bible is the story of Adam and Eve, where Adam and Eve are the first humans, and they're in the Garden of Eden, they're in paradise, and God says to them, enjoy paradise, but do not eat the fruit from the tree over here, the tree of knowledge. And so Adam and Eve, they carry on their lives, but then one day when Eve's hanging about by the tree by herself, a serpent comes up to her and says, look, why don't you have some of this fruit from the tree of knowledge? Why don't you get Adam to eat some of this fruit from the tree of knowledge? And she does. And so Adam eats the fruit from the tree of knowledge, and God's very upset. And so he banishes them and the rest of the human race from the Garden of Eden forever. And so this story was quite often repeated and used as an illustration that women were weak. Adam wouldn't have fallen for the serpents. What serpent trying to persuade him? No, but Eve did. So women were portrayed as weak, but also women are portrayed as tempting men into sin. So it was Eve that tempted Adam with the apple. And so this kind of perception, which was passed down in stories, was a culturally accepted fact, was that women were weaker physically, weaker willed, and also tempted men into sin. The second thing which really defined a woman's role in society was the fact that she legally belonged to another man. So when a woman was a child, as girls, they belonged to their father. They were their father's legal possession. And then quite often women were married as soon as they reached could give birth. They were married. And quite often these marriages were arranged as well. Quite often the men didn't have any say in who they were marrying, especially with the nobility. And even if a woman wasn't married, but if she became pregnant, for example, she would still have to pay fines and be tried in the court of the local lord of the manor, because she was still kind of legally his possession. So a woman was always the possession of another man, whether it was her father, the lord of the manor, or her husband. And it was only really through being widowed, so if they outlived their husband, that actually a woman could enjoy any kind of independence or freedom. So the first thing was that women were seen as weaker than men. The second was that women were the legal possession of another man. And finally, the women's role was defined by the challenge of childbirth. So childbirth in the Middle Ages, before any advances in medicine had been made, was incredibly dangerous. Historians estimate that about 1 in 3 women in the Middle Ages died in childbirth. So it's an incredibly dangerous thing to do. This illustration showing a caesarean section, where if there are complications in a birth, then cuts made in the woman's stomach and the baby is lifted out. This isn't, if you don't know about childbirth, it isn't actually an illustration of how women usually give childbirth, but speak to your PSHE teacher about that. So this is a caesarean section, and this was only done as a very last resort, and almost always resulted in the woman dying at the expense of the life of the unborn child. So this was also an age when there was there was next to no birth control, there was no sex education, there was and a lot of the technology, like modern technology like the pill, hadn't been developed. So most women spent most of their lives either pregnant or looking after infant children, and this really did limit their options for what they could do on a day-to-day basis. So these two things really defined the potential that women could fulfil in society. The fact, just go over them again because they are important. So the fact that women were seen as weaker and tempting men into sin, the fact that women were either the legal possessions of their fathers or their husbands, and childbirth was incredibly common, but also incredibly dangerous. So for the vast majority of women who were villeins or peasants, these three factors meant that quite often they were at home because they were either pregnant or looking after young children, and they were looking after the hut that they lived in. But actually, they usually didn't just stay in the home; they did all sorts of other tasks as well. So here's an illustration of women doing the back-breaking labour of bringing in the harvest, and there's lots of other illustrations of women doing all the other jobs that men did as peasant farmers, so sowing crops, tending to cattle, milling, threshing corn. It was usually the man that actually ran the windmill. So women, it wasn't a situation where women stayed in the hut and the men went out to the fields and did the work. No, women were there with their husbands, doing the back-breaking labour on the farms. If they had a little child, then it would be strapped to them, or if they were old enough, the children would be helping out as well. So everyone was involved in the work on the farm. Here we have a wonderful little illustration of some women involved in hunting rabbits, putting the ferret into the warren and capturing the rabbit coming out and doing that. So women were involved in all of these day-to-day activities which enabled the family to survive. And another key role which was really exclusively to women was, as we talked about before, was weaving the wool into thread, which could then be used, spinning the wool into thread, which could then be used to weave garments, to weave fabric. So it was usually men who owned the looms to make the thread into cloth, but it was the women that spun the wool into thread. And lots of women in their huts had a spin wheel, and they would earn extra money to support the family by spinning the wool into thread, into yarn, so that could then be taken away to the weavers to be made into cloth. And you can see on this illustration the distaff which the woman was using to threaten her husband is attached to the end of the spinning wheel there, which when it's all spun, the woman here can take it out. Just to remind you. So that was really the role of villeins, of most women. They really helped their family to survive, and they worked as hard, if not harder, than the men, bringing in crops, earning extra money by spinning and doing all sorts of other activities as well. So in no way was this a case of women stayed at home, looked after the children, cleaned the house whilst the man went off and worked. Not at all. They were out there working harder than the men. Now, noble women, they were also confined by the three things that we looked at the top. They were seen as weaker than noble men. They had to get married and were in the possession of their fathers or their husbands, and they also had to suffer the horror and the dangers of childbirth, because there was no medical developments really which would make their lives any more comfortable than those of peasant women. So, but noble women usually or almost always had servants to do all of their work for them. So noble men didn't have to go and work out in the field, and neither did noble women. And so noble women even usually had wet nurses who looked after their children if they had children. So noble women had more time on their hands, and so quite often noble women invested this time into developing skills, quite often in the arts. So here we have an image of four young maidens who are playing music to the Queen. Quite interesting in this image, though, that one of those young maidens is actually holding a distaff again, because it became a kind of badge which artists would use to show that that the people in the picture were women. Quite often maidens, unmarried women, was carrying a distaff, because quite often women carried distaffs around because they spent a lot of time spinning. So here we have women developing their musical skills and playing music for the Queen. Some women developed other skills. A very tiny few invested time learning to read and to write, and this is actually an illustration of a very famous artist from France writer from France called Christine of Béziers, and she would quite often she wrote poetry. She wrote what were called ballads, which are kind of epic stories told through verse, but she'd also write kind of commentaries about what kings of France were doing at the time and pass comment on them as well. So kind of like a journalist of the time. But here's a beautiful illustration from one of her books, which was called 100 Ballades, so 100 songs or 100 ballads. And so some women developed a range of artistic prowesses. And also in this illustration, it shows that women were also sometimes involved in the hunt. So this was a really favourite pastime of most noble medieval men, was to go hunting for stags or for boars. Or whatever, and it used to be sort of one of the big things that the nobles men did, because it showed off their military skills in riding on a horse and firing an arrow and all those sorts of things. But here we have women involved in a hunt as well. So we have a woman firing an arrow at a stag there. We have women tending to the hounds. So it showed that roles which we might think of traditionally were exclusively for men, actually there's evidence that women participated in these roles as well. Now, for many women, both rich and poor, the horrors and the dangers of childbirth seemed quite terrifying. They didn't like the idea of being a possession of either a husband or a father. And they didn't want to go around the rest of their lives being seen as weak and not quite as good as men. So a small proportion, but quite a significant proportion of women actually decided to become nuns. They decided to dedicate their whole lives to prayer and to the worship of God, and so they would rather than suffer the dangers of childbirth, to belong to a husband, they would go and join a nunnery, and there they would be given a little cell for them to live in. And then what they would do is starting quite often from 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, they'd start a daily routine of prayer, regularly praying every day, and maybe spending a little bit of time tending to some crops to feed the other nuns, but mostly their life is dedicated to prayer. And clearly this was a very attractive change of life for many women who didn't like the other choices that were on offer for them. So nunneries were very quite often very popular places, for women to go to become nuns, and because quite often they became quite large institutions, those nuns that were in charge of these nunneries, what we call abbesses, became very powerful and very influential people. Remember, rich people would give abbeys and monasteries quite significant donations of money to pray for them when they died, so that they wouldn't have to spend so long in purgatory and to get to heaven quicker. So actually a lot of these nunneries became very rich, owned large amounts of land, so became very powerful in many areas because they owned large amounts of land, and so the abbesses in charge became very powerful, significant women, and sometimes had a direct influence with kings and queens of the time. And there are also many other very powerful we'll talk about more powerful women later, but also women would also do a really wide variety of jobs as well. So this illustration shows women having key roles in counting houses of the time. So these would be places where people might settle up debts, or might go to loan money from, but then have to repay them. And here we can see women being the key people, doing the record keeping, doing all of the mathematics involved, and having a really powerful role in the local community. And this image as well shows that women were also could develop their mathematical skills, and quite often became key teachers in mathematics too. And throughout the Middle Ages, there were individual women who became incredibly powerful and became incredibly influential in the history of their countries at the time. And as I've said, when we've been going through the Middle Ages, we've quite often been talking about men. And it is called his story rather than her story, because it tends to be about men a lot. But there were in the Middle Ages some very powerful and very influential women. Now this is an illustration of a French woman called Isabella, who was actually, and here she is. This illustration shows her parading into Paris as a princess, but she went on to marry the King of England, Edward II, and she took a lover called Robert of Mortimer, and she actually, with Robert of Mortimer's help, ended up ending Edward II's reign and replacing him. So she was very instrumental in the politics of England at the time. Another very powerful medieval woman, which we've talked about before, was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, she in the 12th century, she was first of all married to the King of France, but then they divorced, and she then married Henry II, the King of England, and went on to be the mother of two future kings of England, so Richard the Lionheart, and then King John. And during the reign of King John, she was thought by many historians to be one of the real powers behind the throne, and effectively telling John what to do and how he should run the country. So Eleanor of Aquitaine is this incredibly powerful figure in the history of both France and England in the 12th century. And another very famous powerful medieval woman you may have heard of is called Joan of Arc. Now, she was a French peasant girl. This is at a time when France and England were at war with each other, and she claimed to the Prince of France, the Dauphin, that she had been visited by the angel Gabriel, and that she'd heard voices telling her to go to the Prince of France, the Dauphin, and he would give her a massive army, and she would go and fight the English and drive the English out of France. And to cut a long story short, she was given an army, and she did go and win a couple of very decisive battles against the English, the most famous of which is relieving the siege of the French town Orleans, so she's quite often known as the Maid of Orleans. Eventually she was captured by the English and tried as a witch and burnt to death. But in a few short years she actually managed to become a very famous military commander, gain the trust of the King of France, and became a formidable commander in the field, and actually struck fear into the English troops. So I hope that has illuminated your understanding of what the role of medieval women was, and hopefully those preconceptions that you had, that back in the olden days women just stayed at home, looked after the kids whilst the men went out and did all the hard work, that women weren't powerful at all, that it was the men had all the control, is absolute rubbish, and is back to this illustration as well, as this illustration shows that women were just as much in charge in the Middle Ages as they always have been.